Hello there and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales. Tonight we drift westward across the sea to an old green island wrapped in mist, into the myths of ancient Ireland. Imagine a land where the hills are hollow and full of light, where rivers are the bodies of goddesses, and the sea has a lord who rides it on a horse of foam. Imagine a people who believed that just beside our world, close enough to touch on certain nights, lay another country where no one grows old and no one weeps for long. This is the land of the Tuatha Dé Danann, of Cú Chulainn and Fionn, of swans that were once children and heroes who traded 300 years for a single step. You do not need to remember any of it. You only need to let the stories carry you, the way a slow tide carries a small boat out into the dark. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, let your shoulders soften and your breathing slow. Let the room grow quiet and warm around you. Let's begin. The old Irish believed in another world that lay beside this one. They did not imagine their heaven far above the clouds, or their land of the dead deep beneath the earth. Instead, they spoke of the Otherworld, a country that lay alongside ours, only a breath away. It had many names. Sometimes it was Tir na nÓg, the land of the young. Sometimes it was Mag Mell, the plain of delight, or Oisín na Blach, the isle of apple trees. It could be reached across the western sea, or through a cave, or down beneath the still surface of a lake, or simply by stepping inside one of the green hills on the right night of the year. In that country the fruit was always ripe, the singing never ended, and wounds healed as you watched. Time moved strangely there. A single evening of feasting might be 300 years in the world you left behind. For the people who told these tales, the boundary between the living and the marvelous was thin, and always shifting, a door left slightly open in the hillside. And so we begin at that door. Ireland's whole history was once told as a series of arrivals. Long before written record, the learned men of Ireland gathered the old stories into a great account they called the Book of Invasions. It tells that the island was settled again and again, each people arriving across the water, flourishing for a time, and then giving way to the next. First came a granddaughter of Noah, fleeing the flood, then a people who cleared the first plains, then farmers, then miners and builders, each wave shaping the land a little more. It reads less like a chronicle and more like a slow tide coming in and going out, wave after wave over uncounted years. The monks who wrote it down tried to fit these myths beside the stories of the Bible, stitching the old gods into a family tree that reached back to the beginning of the world. What survives is a strange and lovely thing, half memory and half dream. It tells us less about who truly came to Ireland, and more about how deeply its people longed to know where they had come from. Before the flood, a woman led the very first settlers to Ireland. Her name was Cessair, and the oldest tales say she was among the earliest of all to reach the island, arriving just before the great flood covered the world. She came with a small company across a long and frightening sea, seeking a corner of the earth so clean and untouched that the coming disaster might somehow pass it by. For a little while they lived on the empty green shore, the first human voices the land had ever heard. But the water rose all the same, as the old stories said it must, and her people were lost beneath it. Only fragments of her tale survive, worn soft by time, a name and a landing and a sorrow. Yet there is something tender in the fact that the Irish chose to begin their long story with her. Before the heroes, before the gods, before the great battles, there was a woman looking for a safe place in the world. It is a wish as old as people themselves. One man alone survived the great flood by living beneath the waves. The old tales tell that not quite everyone was lost when the flood covered the world. One of Cessair's companions, a man named Fionn, escaped the rising water in the strangest of ways. He was changed into a salmon, and in that shape he slipped beneath the waves and survived, swimming in the deep while the world drowned above him. Afterward, he took other shapes across the long ages, an eagle, a hawk, and at last a man once more, and he lived on and on, for thousands of years, through every one of the invasions and settlements of Ireland. He saw them all come and go, the peoples and the gods and the heroes, and forgot nothing. In the later tales, he appears as the oldest living thing in the land, a white-haired sage summoned before the kings to tell them the true history of Ireland, because he alone had been there to witness it. There is something wonderful in this thought of a single long memory swimming quietly through all of time, a creature who was present at the very beginning and carried the whole story forward inside himself, which is, in a smaller way, exactly what every storyteller does. After the flood, a leader named Fionn cleared the first plains. When the waters had gone down and the land lay bare again, the tales say a man named Fionn came to the empty island with his family and followers. Under their hands, Ireland began to take the shape we would know. Where there had been only wilderness, they opened the first 4 great plains, so that grass and grazing could spread. Lakes broke out of the ground to meet them. They brought the first cattle, kindled the first cooking fires, and, it is said, brewed the first ale on Irish soil. For a time it was a golden little age of beginnings, but a shadow moved against them too, a strange and hostile people from the sea, whom the stories call the Fomorians, and later a sickness swept through Fionn's folk and carried nearly all of them away. Still, what they had made remained. The plains stayed open, the lakes stayed full. In these old tales, a people can vanish entirely and yet leave the very shape of the land behind them as a gift. The next people to come were named for their leader, Nemed. After Fionn's folk had faded, the island lay quiet again until a man called Nemed arrived across the sea with his household. His name means something like sacred or privileged, and his people worked hard at the slow labor of settling a wild country. More plains were cleared, more lakes appeared, more of the land was gentled, but theirs was a harder time. The Fomorians, those grim sea raiders, pressed them cruelly, demanding a heavy tribute each year at the Feast of Salmon when the light was failing. There were fierce battles against a Fomorian stronghold on a lonely northern island, victories won and then lost again. In the end, Nemed's people were scattered. Some fled north, some south, some far across the sea, and their children would return one day under other names. For now it is enough to feel the rhythm of these old stories. The same slow melody playing over and over, a people arriving, building, struggling, and passing on, while the green island quietly outlasts them all. Some of Nimed's descendants returned as the Fir Bolg. The scattered children of Nemed did not vanish from the tale. One branch of them, the stories say, came back to Ireland after long years of hardship in far countries, and these were the Fir Bolg, the people of the bags. An old and charming legend explains the name. In their exile, they had been forced to carry heavy soil in leather bags, and when at last they were free, they made those bags into boats or into sails and rowed them home. Whatever the truth of it, the Fir Bolg settled the island and gave it a shape it would keep. It was they, the tales say, who first divided Ireland into its provinces and who set up the idea of a true and sacred kingship. They ruled for a time in reasonable peace, but out on the horizon, another people were already gathering, wiser and stranger than any who had come before, wrapped in cloud and carrying marvels. Their arrival would change everything. The Tuatha Dé Danann arrived hidden inside a mist. Now we come to the heart of the old mythology, to the people the Irish remembered as their gods. They were called the Tuatha Dé Danann, the folk of the goddess Danu, and the tales say they came to Ireland on a dark cloud, drifting down out of the northern sky. In some versions, they burned their own ships behind them the moment they landed, so that the smoke of the burning rose up and became the very mist that hid them, and so that no one, not even themselves, could ever turn back. They had lived, it was said, in 4 great cities in the north of the world, learning poetry and magic and craft from the finest teachers alive. When they stepped out of the cloud onto Irish soil, they were beautiful and terrible and skilled beyond anything the island had seen. The land itself seemed to lean toward them, and they had not come empty-handed. From each of their 4 cities they had carried away a single treasure. The Tuatha Dé Danann brought 4 great treasures with them. From each of their 4 northern cities, the people of Danu carried away one wonder, and together these became the 4 treasures of Ireland. From the city of Phaelus came the Lyre Fail, the stone of destiny, which would cry out beneath the feet of a rightful king. From Gorius came a terrible spear, said to belong to Lugh, that made its wielder unbeatable in battle. From Findius came the sword of Nuada, from which no enemy could escape once it was drawn. And from Murius came the great cauldron of the Dagda, from which no company ever went away hungry. A stone, a spear, a sword, a cauldron, sovereignty, victory, protection, and plenty. It is as if a whole people had gathered up everything they most longed for and carried it home in their arms. Each treasure carries its own story, and we will meet them again as the night goes on. But hold them for a moment, these 4 bright things resting in the dark, and let them settle you. Even the old gods, it seems, needed only a few good things to feel that the world was whole. The stone of destiny was said to sing beneath the true king. The first of the 4 treasures was the Lyre Fail, a tall standing stone set up on the hill of Tara, at the sacred center of the land. Its purpose was strange and beautiful. When a man who was truly meant to be High King of Ireland placed his foot upon it, or stood beside it as part of the old rite, the stone would cry out with a great roar of joy, a sound heard across the whole plain. For a false claimant, it stayed silent as any ordinary rock. In this one image you can feel how the old Irish understood kingship. A king was not simply the strongest man, or the one with the largest army. He was the one the land itself accepted, the one at whose touch the very stones of the country sang. The Lyre Fail still stands on the hill of Tara today, weathered and grey, keeping its own counsel, and on a quiet evening it is easy to imagine that it is only waiting, patient as stone always is, for the right foot to fall. Nuada, the first king of the Tuatha, lost his hand and his crown when the people of Danu came to Ireland. Their king was Nuada, a fair and noble ruler, but the island was already held by the Fir Bolg, and the 2 peoples met at last in a great battle on a western plain. The Tuatha won the day, yet the victory cost Nuada dearly. In the fighting his hand was struck from his arm. Now there was an old and unbending law among these people, that no man could be king if his body was not whole and unblemished. And so Nuada, a good king and a brave one, was quietly set aside, because he had given his hand for his people. It seems a hard rule, and it was, but it speaks of an idea that ran deep in the old world, that the health of a king and the health of his land were one and the same thing. A wounded king, they feared, would make a wounded country, and so for a time, another would have to rule in his place. The healers of the Tuatha gave Nuada a hand of silver. Nuada was not left broken for long. Among the Tuatha Dé Danann was a great physician named Dian Cecht, the finest healer of that or any age. For their fallen king he fashioned a marvel, a working hand of pure silver, every finger jointed and moving as a living hand would move. From then on the king was known as Nuada Getlam, Nuada of the silver arm, and the name has a cold gleam to it even now. Yet the story does not end there. Dian Cecht's own son, Miach, was a healer greater still than his father, and he was not content with silver. Over 3 days and nights, the old tale says, he called flesh back over the bones, until Nuada had a hand of true skin and blood once more. It was a wonder even among that wonder-working people, and it meant that the old king, made whole again, might one day be fit to take back his crown when his people had need of him. While Nuada was set aside, a harsh king ruled in his place. With Nuada unfit to reign, the Tuatha chose a new king named Brez, whose name means the beautiful. And beautiful he was, for his father was of the Fomorians, that strange sea people, and something of their otherness clung to him. But a fair face is not the same as a fair heart. Brez proved to be a mean and grasping ruler. Under him the great lords of the Tuatha were set to menial labor, and the old warm law of hospitality was forgotten. In that world a king was judged above all by his generosity, by whether the fires of his hall were lit and his cauldrons full for any guest. Brez let his fires go cold. A poet who came to his door and was turned away hungry made a savage verse against him, and it is said this was the first satire ever spoken in Ireland, so sharp that it raised blotches on the king's face and shamed him before all. A king who would not give, the story tells us, could not keep even the beauty he was born with. Beyond the shore waited an older, darker people called the Fomorians. Again and again in these tales, a shadow rises out of the sea, and that shadow is the Fomorians. They were an ancient race, older it seemed than the settled peoples of the land, and they came out of the ocean and the fog to raid and to demand tribute. The storytellers pictured them as strange and misshapen, some with a single eye or a single leg, powers of storm and blight and the wild, ungoverned sea. Yet they were not simply monsters. Their king could marry a daughter to a king of the Tuatha, as happened with Breeze, and their blood ran in some of the gods themselves. It is best to think of them not as villains, but as the other half of the world, the wave that pulls back as the tide comes in, the winter that answers the summer. The old Irish knew that the sea both feeds and drowns. In the Fomorians, they gave that knowledge a face and set it out on the water where they could see it coming. The most feared of the Fomorians was Bala of the Poison Eye. Among all the Fomorians, one name carried a special dread, and that was Balor. He was a giant of their people, and in the middle of his brow he bore a single terrible eye, kept closed by a heavy lid so weighty that it took several men with hooks and rings to haul it open. But when it was opened, its gaze was death. Whatever it looked upon withered, and armies were said to fall like grass beneath a scythe. It was a power too great to use often, and Balor kept it shut away like a weapon locked in a vault. Yet Balor lived under a shadow of his own. A druid had foretold that he would one day be killed by his own grandson, and so, to cheat the prophecy, he shut his only daughter Ethnew away in a lonely tower of glass on a sea cliff, far from the sight of any man. He thought he had made himself safe, but prophecies in these old tales are patient things, and they are very hard to lock away. The prophecy escaped, and a shining child was born. A warrior of the Tuatha named Fionn had a quarrel with Balor, and by cunning and by magic he found his way into the glass tower where Ethnew was hidden. There the two of them loved one another, and in time a child was born, the grandson that Balor had tried so hard to prevent. When Balor learned of it, he cast the infant into the sea to drown, but the child was saved from the waves, some say by the sea god himself, and carried away to be fostered in secret. He grew into a young man radiant and gifted beyond measure, and he was given a name that shone. He was Lug, and one day he would walk up to the gates of the King of Ireland and change the fortunes of the world. Balor had locked a door, thrown a child to the sea, and done everything a frightened man could do, and still the future he feared was out there, growing taller by the year, learning every art there was to learn. A stranger came to the gate of Tara, claiming every skill at once. When Lug was grown, he came to the royal hall at Tara, where the Tuatha Dé Danann held their court, and asked to be let in. The doorkeeper told him that no one entered unless he had a craft to offer the king. "I am a builder," said Lug. "We already have a builder," said the doorkeeper. "I am a smith. We have a smith." And so it went. Lug named himself a warrior, a harper, a poet, a healer, a cupbearer, a sorcerer, a craftsman in metal, and to each the doorkeeper answered that such a man was already within. "Then ask the king this," said Lug at last. "Do you have any one man who can do all of these things together?" And at that the door was opened, for the king had no such man, and there was no such man in all the world but this one. From this the young god took a title that stayed with him, Lug Samaldanoch, Lug of the many arts. He was not the best at any single thing, the tale seems to say, but he alone could hold them all. The Dagda was the great father god, mighty and comically human. Chief among the Tuatha was the Dagda, whose name means simply the good god, though good here meant good at all things rather than merely virtuous. He was enormous, immensely strong, wise in magic, and yet the storytellers loved to paint him as almost comic, dressed in a tunic too short for him, dragging a club so vast it had to be hauled on a wheeled cart. That club was itself a marvel. One end of it killed 9 men at a blow, while the other end, drawn gently across them, could call the slain back to life. He carried, too, a great cauldron that never ran dry, so that every guest went away satisfied. There is something wonderfully whole about the Dagda. He was death and healing in a single weapon, appetite and generosity in a single pot, a god you could fear and laugh with in the same breath. The old Irish did not want their great god to be distant and perfect. They wanted him vast and warm and a little bit ridiculous, the way the people we truly love always are. The Dagda owned a living harp that ordered the seasons. Among the Dagda's treasures was a harp, carved of oak and richly ornamented, and it was no ordinary instrument. It was called Oisín, and it knew its master's hand alone. With it, the Dagda could play 3 strains, the old tales say, that ruled the hearts of all who heard. There was the strain of sorrow that set a whole hall weeping. There was the strain of joy that set them laughing. And there was the strain of sleep, the gentlest of the 3, that laid every listener down into deep and dreamless rest. There is a story that enemies once carried the harp away, and the Dagda followed after it into their very feasting hall. He called the harp by its name across the crowded room, and it leapt from the wall into his hands, killing men as it flew. Then he played the sleep strain, and every foe in the hall sank down into slumber, so that he walked out unharmed. Of all the wonders in these tales, this one is a friend to us tonight, a melody that asks nothing but that you let go and rest. The gods and the Fomorians met at last on the plain of Mag Tuatha. All the old tensions came to a head at last, and the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomorians gathered for a great and final battle on a plain called Mag Tuatha, the Plain of Pillars. By now Nuada had his true hand again and his crown restored, but on the eve of battle he wisely gave the leadership to Lug, whose many gifts made him the one man fit to command. The smiths of the Tuatha, chief among them Goibnu, had promised that any spear they made would strike true, and any warrior slain could be healed overnight in a secret well and sent back whole to the fighting. Against this the Fomorians brought their giants and their sorcery, and above them all loomed Balor, with his lid shut, world-ending eye. It was to be a reckoning of 2 ages, the old raw powers of sea and blight against the bright ordered crafts of the gods. And moving through the 2 hosts, unseen, went the prophecy that had waited so long, the grandson and the grandfather, drawing toward one another across the din. Lug brought down Balor with a single, perfect stone. At the height of the battle, the dreadful moment came. Balor's great eye was heaved open, and its killing gaze swept across the field, and even Nuada of the silver arm fell before it. Then Lug came before his grandfather. In some tellings he carried a sling, in others a strange and mighty spear, but the aim was the same. Before the full weight of that gaze could fix upon him, Lug loosed his shot, and it struck the eye so hard that it was driven clean through Balor's skull and out the back of his head. Now the deadly gaze pointed backward, upon the ranks of the Fomorians themselves, and it withered their own host where they stood. So the prophecy was fulfilled to the letter. The grandfather was slain by the grandson, exactly as the druid had said, and no tower of glass nor child thrown to the sea had been able to prevent it. With Balor fallen, the Fomorians broke, and their power over Ireland was ended. The old darkness had not been destroyed, only pushed back beneath the waves, to wait, as such things always wait. The Morrigan was the shape war took when it rose over the field. Not all the powers of the Tuatha were gentle. Among the strangest and most striking was the Morrigan, whose name is often given as the Phantom Queen, or the Great Queen. She was the goddess who moved over battle, and she most often appeared as a crow or a raven, wheeling and calling above the fighting men. She was not a warrior who struck blows so much as a presence that decided them, filling one side with fury and the other with fear, appearing before great deeds to promise victory or to foretell a death. Sometimes she was spoken of as 3 sisters together, a trinity of battle goddesses, for the old Irish loved to see their great powers come in 3s. There is something in her that resists comfort, and perhaps should. She is the truth that where there is a hero, there is a field of the dead, and a black bird settling as the noise fades. Yet even she has her place in the turning of things, and tonight, from a safe distance, we can watch her dark wings and let them pass over and away. At a river's ford, the Morrigan washed the clothes of the doomed. One of the most haunting shapes the Morrigan wore was that of the washer at the ford. On the eve of a battle, or before a hero rode to his death, a lone woman might be seen kneeling at the edge of a river where the road crossed the water. She would be washing bloodied clothing and armor in the stream, wringing it out over and over, and the water would run red around her hands, and the clothes she washed, the traveler slowly understood, were his own. To meet the washer at the ford was to be shown your own ending, quietly, before it came. It sounds a fearful thing, and yet there is a strange gentleness in the image too. The calm of the kneeling figure, the endless patient motion, the river carrying everything away downstream. The old Irish did not hide death from themselves. They gave it a riverbank and a pair of working hands, and made even fate look, for a moment, like someone doing the ordinary washing at the close of the day. Brigid was the bright goddess of fire, poetry, and the forge. If the Morrigan was the dark of these old powers, Brigid was much of the light. She was a daughter of the Dagda, and she held sway over the three things the old Irish held most sacred and most warming, all of them touched by fire. She was the goddess of poetry, of the inspiration that kindles in a poet's mind like a flame. She was the goddess of the smith's forge, of the craft that shapes iron out of the red heat, and she was the goddess of healing, and of the hearth fire itself, the living heart of every home. So beloved was she that when the old ways gave way to the new, her memory did not fade but flowed quietly into the figure of a Christian saint who shared her name, her feast day, and her sacred flame, tended by women and kept burning year upon year. There is a lesson of comfort in that. The things Brigid guarded, warmth and making and the mending of what is hurt, are so needful to us that we could not let them go, and so we carried her, under one name or another, all the way down to now. A goddess ran too close to a forbidden well and became a river. The River Boyne, which winds through the sacred heart of ancient Ireland, was said to be a goddess named Bowen. In her country there stood a hidden well, ringed by 9 magical hazel trees, and it was the well of all knowledge and wisdom in the world. It was forbidden to approach it, save for a very few, and no one else might walk its bounds. But Bowen was proud and curious, and one day she went to the well and walked around it against the sacred way, to test its power, or perhaps simply to know. At that the waters rose up in anger and burst from the earth, and rushed after her across the land. And though she ran, the flood caught her and swept her away and drowned her. Where the water ran, it did not sink back, but stayed, and became the river that still bears her name. So a goddess became a river, her body the water that feeds the fields to this day. In these tales, the land is never merely land. It is somebody, remembered, still flowing. Angus, the god of love, was born of a day that did not exist. Bowen, before she became a river, had a son by the Dagda, and his story begins with a gentle deception. To hide the child from Bowen's husband, the Dagda used his power over time. He made the sun stand still, so that the whole span from the child's conception to his birth passed in what seemed a single day. In this way the boy was born, as the old riddle has it, on a day that was neither one day nor another. He was named Angus, and he became the god of love and of youth, the most charming of all the Tuatha, forever young and forever gentle. Small birds were said to circle his head, and it was told that his very kisses turned into these birds. When he grew, he wanted a home, and by a clever trick of words he won from his father the great mound at Brunabuni, the shining house on the river, and made it his own forever. Of all the gods, Angus is the one it is easiest to love. He was born of stolen time, and he spent his eternity on the things time cannot keep, youth and beauty and the ache of the heart. Angus fell in love with a woman he had only seen in a dream. The loveliest of the tales of Angus is the one called The Dream of Angus. Night after night, the young god dreamed of a maiden more beautiful than any he had ever seen. He reached for her in the dream, and she was gone, and he woke with an ache in his chest that would not leave him. He grew sick with longing for a woman who might not even be real. His parents searched all Ireland for her, and at last she was found. Her name was Kaya, and she lived under an enchantment, taking the shape of a swan every second year, moving with a great flock upon a lake. Angus was told he might have her only if he could pick her out from among the birds and call her to him. So he went to the lake, and among 150 swans he knew her at once. He called, and she came, and he too took the form of a swan, and together they rose and circled the water 3 times, singing an air so sweet it laid all who heard it asleep for 3 days. Then they flew away together to his house on the river. Some searches, the story says, are worth a lifetime of dreaming. The sea itself had a lord, and his name was Manannán mac Lir. Beyond the shore, in the roll and shimmer of the waves, ruled Manannán mac Lir, the son of the sea. He was the god of the ocean and of the mists, and he was the ferryman and gatekeeper of the Otherworld, for the roads to that country so often ran across the water. To him the sea was not a barrier but a plain, and the waves were his galloping horses. He rode over them in a chariot, or sailed in a boat that needed neither oar nor sail, but went wherever its master wished. Around his islands he could raise a magical fog to hide them from mortal eyes, so that a sailor might pass close by the blessed isles and never know they were there. Manannán moved between the worlds as easily as we move between rooms, and he took a kindly interest in the affairs of gods and mortals alike, appearing in many later tales as a mysterious traveller in a cloak. When you next stand at the edge of the sea and watch the grey water heave and shine, you are looking at his kingdom, wide and old and never quite still. Manannán owned marvels drawn from the wonder of the sea. The Sea Lord's treasures were as strange and generous as the ocean itself. He had a boat called Wave Sweeper that read its owner's thoughts and carried him without command. He had a horse that could gallop as freely over the water as over green fields. He had a cloak that, when he shook it between 2 lovers, made them forget one another entirely, so that their sorrow was folded away like mist. He had a sword called the Answerer, from which no wound could be undone. And he kept, it was said, a herd of otherworldly pigs that could be killed and eaten one day, and would be alive again the next, so that his people never ran short of the feast. In these gifts you can feel how the old Irish saw the sea, as a place of endless plenty and endless danger, a giver that could also take everything away. Manannán held both halves in his hands, the drowning wave and the full net, and rode above them all, laughing in the salt wind. A god named Midir loved a woman across the span of 1,000 years. One of the most patient love stories of the Tuatha belongs to Midir, a lord of the Sidhe, and a woman named Oisín. Midir loved her and took her as his wife, but his first wife grew jealous, and being skilled in sorcery, she worked a cruel spell. She turned Oisín into a pool of water, and then, as the water dried, into a worm, and then into a beautiful purple fly. As a fly, Oisín stayed close to Midir, and the sweetness of her humming and the fragrance of her comforted him, so that he wanted no other company. But the jealous wife raised a great wind that blew the fly far away, and for long years Oisín was tossed about the world, houseless and small, remembering nothing of who she had been. Midir did not forget her, and though ages passed, and Oisín's story took many turns before he found her again, his love did not falter. It is a strange and lovely thing to sit with, this idea that love might outlast even the shape of the beloved, and wait until she came round again. Oisín was reborn when she fell into a woman's cup. The wandering of Oisín came to its turn at last in the simplest of ways. After more than 1,000 years adrift as a fly, she was blown one evening through the window of a great house and fell into the golden cup of a woman at a feast. The woman, not seeing, drank her down, and in time conceived and bore a daughter, and that daughter was Oisín, born new into the world, human now, and remembering nothing of her long enchantment or her divine husband, she grew into a woman of surpassing beauty, and married a high king of Ireland. And there the old story circles back, for Midir, still faithful across the centuries, came at last to find her and to win her home, playing games of chess for her with her mortal husband, staking everything on the last. There is a deep old comfort in Oisín's tale. Nothing truly ends, it seems to say. What is loved is carried, and lost, and drunk down into the dark, and comes round once more into the light, not knowing where it has been. The champion Ogma cut the first Irish letters from the shapes of trees. Among the Tuatha was Ogma, a great warrior renowned for his strength, called the honey-mouthed for his gift of eloquence. To him, the old tradition gives a wonderful invention. He is said to have created Ogam, the earliest form of writing in Ireland, an alphabet made not of curves and loops, but of straight strokes cut across and along the edge of a standing stone or a length of wood. Each letter was a set of notches, 1 to 5, above or below, or across a line, simple enough to carve with a blade on the corner of a rock. And each letter, in the old law, was linked to a tree, birch and rowan, alder, willow and oak, so that to spell was almost to walk through a wood. Many of these Ogam stones still stand in the fields of Ireland and beyond, their notched edges, worn but readable, marking a grave or a boundary from 1500 years ago. There is something moving in the thought of it, a warrior god teaching his people to fix a name in stone, so that a person might be remembered a little longer than a single life allows. The Tuatha had a smith whose feast kept the gods from growing old. The crafts of the Tuatha Dé Danann were held almost holy, and none more so than the work of the forge. Their chief smith was Goibniu, who with his fellow craftsmen forged the weapons that won the great battle, spears and swords so perfectly made that they never missed and always killed. But Goibniu was more than an armourer. He was the host, the old tales say, of a wondrous feast, the Feast of Goibniu, and the ale he brewed and poured at that gathering had a marvellous power. Whoever drank of it was kept from sickness, from age, and from death itself, so that the gods stayed forever young and strong. Here again is that deep old longing running through all these stories, the wish to hold off the slow undoing that time works on everything living. The Tuatha answered it with a smith and a cup of ale, with craft and good company by the fire. It is not so different, perhaps, from the small comforts we still reach for against the dark, warmth and drink, and the faces of friends, holding the years at bay for one more night. The healer of the gods kept a well that gave the dead back their lives. We met Dian Siege already, the physician who made Nuada's silver hand. His deepest magic was saved for the battlefield. Beside the field of the great battle he set a well, and into its water he and his family sang healing charms and cast healing herbs. When a warrior of the Tuatha fell, his body was carried and laid in the well, and by morning, the old tale says, he rose from it whole and well and ready to fight again, though he could not speak of what he had seen. So the gods seemed unkillable, for their slain returned each dawn like the sun. When their enemies discovered the secret of the well, they filled it with stones to stop its power, and the tide of the battle turned. There is a quiet wisdom folded into this story, under the wonder. Even among the gods, healing was not a single miracle, but a patient nightly work, a laying down in still water, a rising at dawn, and when the well was stopped, even they became mortal. Nothing that lives, it seems, is promised the morning, which is only more reason to be gentle with the night. 3 brothers were sent to the ends of the earth to pay for a killing. Not all the tales of the gods are of triumph. One of the 3 great sorrows of Irish storytelling is the fate of the sons of Turin. These 3 brothers killed Cian, the father of Loch, in a quarrel, and tried to hide the deed by burying him in the ground, but the earth itself gave up the crime. When Loch learned who had slain his father, he did not take their lives at once. Instead, he set them a series of tasks as their payment, a fine so vast it was almost impossible, sending them to gather marvels from the far corners of the world, a healing pigskin, a magical spear, a cooking spit from a drowned island, and more, each guarded by kings and dangers. The brothers succeeded at nearly all of it, wandering the earth through hardship and wonder. But the last tasks were their undoing, and they came home mortally wounded, begging Lug for the one healing thing that could have saved them. He refused, and they died. It is a hard tale, and an old one, of a debt paid to the very last, and a grief that even success could not buy off. 4 royal children were turned into swans for 900 years. Another of the 3 great sorrows of Irish storytelling is the fate of the children of Lear. Lear was a lord of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and he had 4 beloved children, 3 sons and a daughter, whose gentle mother had died. In time he married her sister Aoife, but the new wife grew bitterly jealous of the love he bore the children. One day she brought them to a lonely lake, and there, by a cruel enchantment, she turned the 4 of them into white swans. They kept their own soft voices and their human minds, but they were bound to live as swans upon the cold water for 900 years, 300 upon one gentle lake, 300 upon a narrow strait, and 300 upon a wild and stormy western sea. Through all those long centuries they swam and sang, comforting one another through the dark winters, faithful and unchanged, while the whole world they had known passed slowly away and was forgotten. When at last the enchantment broke, they became human once more, but as ancient, fading figures, and soon they slipped away. Their sweet singing drifting over the grey water is among the most tender and sorrowful images in all of Irish story. At last a mortal people came, and the gods withdrew into the hills. Every age in these stories gives way, and the age of the Tuatha Dé Danann ended when the last invaders came. These were the Milesians, the sons of Meal, and they were not gods but mortal men and women, the ancestors, the old Irish believed, of themselves. They came from the south across the sea, and when they landed they claimed the island for their own. The Tuatha, for all their magic, could not turn them back, and after hard bargaining and a final battle, a strange and peaceable settlement was reached. Ireland would be divided between the 2 peoples. The Milesians would have the surface of the land, the green fields and the open air, and the Tuatha Dé Danann would take the half below, the hidden island within the hills, and under the water, the country of the Sidhe. So the gods did not die, and did not leave. They only stepped sideways, into the mounds and the mist, and closed the green doors behind them. And there the old people believed, they are living still. The poet Imogen sang Ireland into the possession of his people. When the Milesians first came to the shore, the tale gives the moment to a poet rather than a warrior. His name was Emergin, and he was the file, the sacred poet of the sons of Meal. As he set his right foot upon the land of Ireland, he spoke a great strange poem, one of the oldest in the whole tradition. I am the wind on the sea, he said. I am the wave of the ocean. I am the roar of the sea. I am the stag of 7 tines. I am a hawk on a cliff. I am a tear of the sun. I am the fairest of flowers. On and on it went, the poet naming himself as the wind and the water and the wild things, as if to say that he and the land were not 2 things but one. In claiming Ireland, he did not boast of armies. He dissolved himself into it. There is a deep old idea sleeping in those lines, that a person is not shut away inside their skin, but runs out into the whole living world and belongs to it and is it. Let that thought widen around you like water as you rest. Ireland took its name from a goddess who asked to be remembered. As the Milesians moved through the country, they met, one after another, 3 goddesses of the Tuatha, 3 queens of the land, named Banba, Fodla, and Eriu. Each in turn came to the newcomers and asked that the island be named after her. Emergin the poet promised each that it would, but it was Eriu whom the poet met on the sacred hill at the center of the land, and it was to her that the truest promise was given. She foretold that this island would belong to her people's conquerors forever, and asked only that her name live on upon it, and so it has. From Eriu comes Erie, the name the Irish still give their country in their own tongue, and from it, in a longer road through other languages, comes the very word Ireland. A goddess of the old vanished gods asked one thing of the future, not worship, not a throne, only that her name be spoken. Every time the country is named, she gets her wish. There are worse ways, perhaps, to be remembered. The old gods became the fair folk who live beneath the ground. When the Tuatha Dé Danann passed into the hollow hills, they did not simply disappear from the minds of the people. They changed, over the long centuries, into the Aosc, the people of the mounds, the fairy folk of Irish tradition. These were not the tiny winged creatures of later storybooks. They were tall and beautiful and proud, the diminished gods, living their bright, unfading lives just out of sight, in the raths and the barrows and the green mounds that dot the countryside. They could be gracious or dangerous, generous or easily offended, and the country people treated them with great care, calling them the good people, the gentry, the neighbours, so as not to give offence by naming them too plainly. Offerings of milk and bread were left out at the threshold. Certain hills and thorn trees were left untouched for fear of disturbing them. In this quiet way, the old religion never fully died. It went underground, into the hills, and became a thing of courtesy and caution, a set of small kindnesses paid to the powers that were there before us, and might, the people felt, be there still. In the north stood Imin Marca, the fortress of the heroes of Ulster. We leave the gods now, and come down a little closer to the world of men, into the age of heroes. In the north of Ireland, in the province of Ulster, there stood a great royal fortress called Imin Marca, and around it gathered the most famous warband in Irish story, the Red Branch, the champions of Ulster. Here ruled King Conchobar, and here the young warriors were fostered and trained, feasting in the long hall, boasting of their deeds, and riding out to defend their borders. The tales of these heroes make up what we now call the Ulster cycle, and they have a different flavour from the tales of the gods, older and rawer, full of chariots and single combats, of fierce pride and terrible loyalty. Imin Marca was a real place, and its great earthen mound can still be walked upon today, near the city of Armagh, a green ring against the sky. Standing on it, you are standing at the centre of a lost heroic world, where the grass now grows quiet over the ground that once shook with the wheels of war. The fortress was named for a goddess wronged, who left it a curse. Imin Marca took its name from a sorrowful story. A goddess, or an otherworldly woman, named Marca came to live with a mortal farmer, and while she dwelt with him his fortune grew, on the one condition that he never speak of her to anyone. But at a great assembly the man could not keep silent, and boasted that his wife could outrun the king's finest horses. The king, angered, forced her to make good the boast, and though she was heavily pregnant and begged for mercy, she was made to race the chariot. She won, running ahead of the horses to the line, but there she collapsed and gave birth, and in her agony she laid a curse upon the men of Ulster. In their hour of greatest need, she said, when their enemies bore down upon them, the warriors of Ulster would be struck down as helpless as a woman in the pains of childbirth, and so it would be for 9 generations. This is why, when the great crisis came, the men of Ulster lay groaning and could not rise, and their whole defence fell upon one young champion alone. Conchobar mac Nessa came to his throne through his mother's cunning. The king in the hall at Imin Marca was Conchobar mac Nessa, and even his path to the crown was a tale of guile. He owed his kingship not to his own arm, but to his mother, Nessa, a formidable woman who struck a clever bargain with the reigning king. She agreed to marry that king only if he would let her son sit upon the throne for a single year. A small vanity, it seemed, a boy playing at kingship. But over that year Nessa guided her son so wisely, and the young Conchobar ruled so generously, giving away the king's own wealth to win the people's love, that when the year was up the men of Ulster would not have the old king back. They kept the boy. So Conchobar became king in truth, and reigned long over the heroes of the Red Branch. He was brave and clever, but not always just, and much of the sorrow that came to Ulster grew from his pride. Even in the age of heroes, the old tales quietly remind us, a kingdom often turns not on the strength of its warriors, but on the wit and will of one determined woman. Before she was born, it was foretold that Deirdre would bring ruin. The saddest tale of Ulster begins with a prophecy over an unborn child. At a feast in the house of Conchobar's storyteller, the child in the wife's womb cried out, and the king's druid, laying his hand upon her, foretold that the girl to be born would grow into the most beautiful woman in all Ireland, but that her beauty would bring death and exile and the ruin of Ulster. The warriors cried out that the infant should be killed at birth to spare them all, but King Conchobar would not have it. He decreed instead that the child would be raised in secret, hidden away in the forest under the care of a nurse, and that when she was grown, he himself would take her for his wife. So the girl, named Deirdre, grew up alone in a green and lonely place, seeing almost no one, kept like a jewel in a box for a king she did not love. But a prophecy, as we have already learned tonight, is a patient and a stubborn thing, and a young heart shut away from the world will always, in the end, look out through the one window it can find. Deirdre fled with the man she loved, and the tale turned to sorrow. One winter's day, Deirdre saw a raven drinking blood upon the snow, and she said that the man she would love would have hair as black as the raven, skin as white as the snow, and cheeks as red as the blood. Such a man existed, a young warrior of the Red Branch named Noe, and when she met him she would have no other. Together with Noe and his two brothers, the sons of Uisnic, she fled from Ireland across the sea to Scotland to escape the king who claimed her. For a time they lived happily in the wild, hunting and fishing by the lochs, but Conchobar could not forgive the loss. He sent word promising them safe return, swearing no harm would come, and against their better judgment they believed him and sailed home. It was a trap. The sons of Uisnic were killed by the king's treachery, and Deirdre, forced at last into Conchobar's household, lived in silent grief and never smiled again, until she too found her way out of a life she had never chosen. Her name has meant sorrow in Ireland ever since. A small boy killed a fearsome hound and took its place and its name. Now we come to the greatest of all the heroes of Ulster. He was born Setanta, and as a small boy, gifted and fierce beyond his years, he set out one day to follow the king to a feast at the house of Chulainn the smith. He came late, still playing with his hurling stick and ball on the road. Now Chulainn, not knowing a guest was still to come, had loosed his enormous guard dog, a hound so savage it was said to need 3 chains and 3 men on each chain. The beast rushed at the boy, but Setanta struck his ball down the hound's throat with all his strength, or, in another telling, seized it and dashed it against a stone and killed it. The smith, though the boy had only defended his own life, was stricken at the loss of his faithful hound. So the boy made him an offer. Until a pup could be reared to replace the dog, he himself would guard Chulainn's house and lands in its place. And from that day he was called Cú Chulainn, the Hound of Chulainn, and the name has rung down more than 1,000 years. The young hero chose a short and shining life over a long and quiet one. There was a day when Cú Chulainn was still a boy that decided the whole shape of his life. He overheard the druid Cathbad teaching, and a pupil asked what that day was lucky for. Cathbad answered that any warrior who first took up arms on that day would become the most famous hero in all of Ireland, his name on every tongue forever, but that his life would be short. Most would have let such a day pass. Cú Chulainn went straight to the king and demanded his weapons, and so bound himself to the bargain. Glory for years, a great name for a brief life. He knew, even as a boy, exactly what he was choosing, and he chose it with open eyes. There was something both thrilling and unbearably sad in that. He would blaze like a torch and burn out young, and he understood this, and did not flinch. The old Irish admired that choice, though they wept over it too. Not everyone, they knew, is asked to trade length for brightness, but the ones who are and choose the light are the ones we still tell stories about. In the heat of battle, Cú Chulainn was seized by a terrible transformation. Cú Chulainn was no calm and graceful champion. When the battle fury came upon him, he underwent what the tales call the Ria Strad, the warp spasm, a monstrous distortion of body and mind. The old descriptions are wild and frightening. His body would twist within its skin so that his feet and knees turned backward. One eye would sink deep into his skull, while the other bulged huge upon his cheek. His hair stood on end, each strand tipped with a spark of fire, and a great jet of dark blood rose straight up from the crown of his head like a mast. In this state he knew neither friend nor foe, and had to be cooled afterward in vats of cold water to bring him back to himself. It is a strange and violent image, and it captures something the old warriors knew about the madness that can take a man in the killing frenzy of war. Cú Chulainn's greatness and his horror were the same thing. The power that made him unbeatable also made him, for a while, not quite human. We can look on it tonight from a great and peaceful distance and be glad of the quiet. He was trained in arms by a warrior woman across the sea. For all his natural fury, Cú Chulainn's skill was taught, and his greatest teacher was a woman. Her name was Scarthic, a fearsome warrior queen who kept a school of arms on a shadowy island, reached only by crossing a bridge that flung the unworthy back, and a plain where the grass itself could swallow the unwary. To her came the young men who wished to become the finest fighters alive, and Cú Chulainn crossed the sea to learn from her. Under Scarthic he mastered every feat of the champion, the thunder feat and the salmon leap and the running along the shafts of spears, and it was she who taught him to use his most terrible weapon and gave it into his hand. There is something worth pausing on in the fact that the deadliest hero of Ireland owed his craft to a woman on a far island, that the old tales, for all their kings and champions, kept giving their deepest knowledge and their sharpest cunning to women, again and again. Nessa, Marka, Scarthic, and soon another, greater still. The men win the fame, the women so often hold the key. The hero's deadliest weapon was a spear that opened like a flower. The gift Scarthic gave to Cú Chulainn alone was the garbulg, a weapon terrible beyond the others. It was a spear, but a spear with a dreadful secret, cast along the surface of the water and taken up between the toes of the foot. It flew to its mark, and where it entered the body it opened, spreading many barbs inside the wound so that it could not be drawn out again without taking the life with it. It was a weapon of last resort, unfair, unanswerable, kept for the moment when nothing else would serve. Cú Chulainn used it rarely, and each time the tales grow heavy around it, for it always meant a death that could not be undone, and often the death of someone he loved. There is a shadow over this gift, the knowledge that the most decisive power is also the most sorrowful, that to hold in your hand the thing that always wins is to hold the thing that can never be called back. He carried it down to the water's edge only when he had no other road left, and once, terribly, he carried it against his own dearest friend. A great war began with a wife and husband comparing their wealth in bed. The most famous of all the Ulster tales, the Taimbo Cuainn, the cattle raid of Cooley, began with the gentlest of scenes and the smallest of arguments. Medb, the proud queen of Connacht, and her husband Ailill lay talking in bed one night and fell to comparing which of them was the richer. They counted out their possessions, their cups and their jewels, their flocks and their herds, and found themselves matched in everything, equal in every count but one. Ailill owned a magnificent bull, a beast without equal, and Medb had nothing to set against it. This she could not bear. She learned that there was only one bull in Ireland to match her husband's, the great brown bull of Cooley, away in the province of Ulster, and she resolved to have it, by loan if she could, and by force if she must. And so, over a queen's wounded pride and the matter of a single bull, the armies of the south marched north, and a war began that would fill the greatest epic in the Irish tongue. Great sorrows, the old tales know, so often grow from small and human seeds. Ulster's whole defence fell upon one young man because of the ancient curse. When Medb's great army crossed into Ulster, the moment had come that Marka's old curse had foretold. Just when their land was invaded and their need was greatest, the warriors of Ulster were struck down, every one, by the pangs of the curse, lying helpless and groaning in their fortress, unable to lift a spear. All of Ulster lay open to the invader, defended by no one, that is, but a single young man. For Cú Chulainn, being only half of Ulster by blood, or being too young, was not bound by the curse, and he alone could stand. So one youth set himself against the marching host of a whole province. He could not meet them all at once in open battle. Instead, he invoked an ancient law of single combat, challenging their champions to meet him one at a time at the fords of the rivers. And for months, through a long, hard winter, he held the army back almost alone, killing their best each day at the water's edge. It is one of the great images of these tales. One figure at a river crossing, buying his sleeping people time with his own unresting body. Cú Chulainn held the invading army at the fords, one man at a time, Through that long campaign, Cú Chulainn fought a war of single combats, standing at the fords where the army had to cross, and calling out their champions to meet him there. Day after day a hero of Medb's host would come down to the water, and day after day Cú Chulainn would send him back dead, so that the whole vast army was held at bay by one man's endurance. He barely slept. The tales say that the god Lug, his own otherworldly father, came at last and stood watch over him for 3 days, so that the exhausted young hero could rest while the god healed his wounds. Medb tried everything: ambushes against the rules of combat, bribes, and the promise of her own daughter, and still he stood. It could not last, and it did not. But for that long season, the picture holds a single wearied champion at the crossing place of a river, turning back an empire out of loyalty to a land that lay sleeping and could not even thank him. There are kinds of courage that make no noise and simply refuse day after day to fall. The cruelest stroke of the war was a duel between 2 foster brothers. At last Med found the one champion who might match Cú Chulainn, and he was the worst possible choice. His name was Ferdiad, and he and Cú Chulainn had been the closest of friends, trained side by side long ago under Scarthach on her island, bound by all the deep old ties of foster brotherhood. Ferdiad did not want to fight his friend, and refused, until Medb shamed and pressured and threatened him into it. So the two who loved one another came down to the ford to fight to the death. For 3 days they battled, and each evening, the old tale says, they broke off and embraced, and sent food and healing herbs across the water to one another, weeping for what the morning would bring. On the last day, Cú Chulainn was driven to his terrible spear, the Gay Bulg, and with it he killed Ferdiad. Then he laid down his weapons and wept over the body of his friend, saying that all the war had been a game and a sport until Ferdiad came to the ford. Of all the deaths in the tale, the old poets lingered longest and most tenderly on this one, the friend who killed the friend and could not stop grieving. The hero won his wife by passing a series of riddling tests. Not all of Cú Chulainn's story is war. He loved a woman named Emma, the daughter of a chieftain, and he wooed her in a manner fitting for a hero of riddles. When he first came to her, they spoke together in a secret language of hints and dark sayings, testing one another's wit, and Emma told him plainly that she would not marry until he had proved himself with great deeds, and she set him conditions wrapped in riddles. Her father, who did not want the match, set him harder tasks still, sending him away to distant dangers in the hope he would not return. And it was in part this that drove Cú Chulainn to Scathach's island to be trained. But he came back and performed the mighty feats and leapt the walls of Emma's fort and carried her away to be his wife. Theirs was a strong and loving marriage, though not an easy one, for a hero's life is never easy for the one who waits at home. Emma was clever and proud and fiercely loyal, a match in spirit for her restless husband, and she stands among the great women of these tales in her own right. A feast was thrown into uproar over who deserved the champion's portion. Not every Ulster tale is grim. There is a wickedly funny one about a troublemaker named Brickrew, a man who loved nothing so much as setting others at odds. He built a splendid new feasting hall and invited all the heroes of Ulster, and then, for his own amusement, privately promised the champion's portion, the finest cut of the feast, to 3 different heroes at once, whispering to each that he was the greatest and deserved it. The result was exactly the chaos he had hoped for. The 3 champions, Cú Chulainn among them, nearly came to blows, and their wives too fell to quarrelling over who should enter the hall first. To settle the matter, the heroes were sent to be judged by various fearsome tests. At the climax, a monstrous churl appeared and proposed a strange bargain, that a hero might cut off his head tonight if he would lay down his own head to the axe tomorrow. Only Cú Chulainn was brave and honest enough to keep the bargain and bare his neck, and for that he was named the first champion of Ulster. It is a very old story, and a version of it, centuries later, would be told again about a green knight and a king's court far away. The hero was almost lost to the love of a woman of the Otherworld. There is a stranger, dreamier tale in which Cú Chulainn is nearly undone not by war but by love and longing. 2 otherworldly women appeared to him by a lake and beat him with whips until he lay sick and wasted for a year, unable to rise. wrapped in a strange enchantment. At last a messenger came from the Otherworld, from a woman named Fionn, the wife of the sea god Manannán, who had fallen in love with the hero and needed his help against her enemies. Cú Chulainn went to her country and stayed, and loved her, and for a while forgot the mortal world and his own wife Emma. But Emma came for him, with her grief and her fierce love, and Fionn, seeing the pain she was causing, chose to give him up and return to her own husband across the sea. Manannán shook his cloak of forgetting between Cú Chulainn and Fionn, so that they should forget one another and be spared the ache of it, and the hero was brought home and healed. It is a tale of longing for a world beyond this one, and of the quiet mercy of being allowed, at last, to forget a sorrow. Even the greatest hero came at last to his appointed death. Cú Chulainn had chosen a short life, and the day came to pay for the glory. His enemies had gathered, and among them were the children of men he had killed, and they came against him not only with spears, but with spells, and with the breaking of his sacred vows, his giesa, tricking him into acts he was bound never to do, so that his strength and his luck drained away. Wounded to death in his last battle, and knowing the end had come, Cú Chulainn would not fall. He bound himself upright to a tall standing stone with his own belt, so that he might die on his feet, facing his foes, as a champion should. For a long time his enemies dared not approach, for even dying he seemed terrible. Only when a crow, the bird of the Morrigan, came down and settled upon his shoulder, did they understand that the hero was truly dead at last. So he died as he had lived, upright and unbroken, and the stone he was bound to still stands in story as the image of a courage that would not even lie down to die. Far from the heroes, the two great bulls tore each other apart. And what of the bull, the beast that had started the whole terrible war? When the fighting at last wound down, the brown bull of Cooley was carried off into Connacht, and there he met Ailill's great bull, the white-horned one, the only rival worthy of him. The two enormous beasts fell upon each other in a fury and fought across the whole of Ireland, their bellowing shaking the land, tearing up the earth as they wrestled, on through the day and the night. In the end, the brown bull won. He killed his rival and scattered the pieces of him across the country, so that hills and fords still bore the names of where they fell. But the brown bull's own great heart burst with the effort, and soon after he too lay down and died. So the war that had cost so many heroes, that had killed Ferdiad at the ford, ended with 2 dead animals and nothing gained, the herds no richer, the queen's pride no fuller. The old tale lets that silence speak for itself. All that blood, it seems to say, over 2 beasts who destroyed each other in the end. In a later age rose Fionn mac Cumhail and his roving band of hunters. We turn now to a different age and a gentler kind of hero. The tales of the Fenian cycle are set long after the heroes of Ulster, and they have the feel not of the fortress but of the forest. Their hero is Fionn mac Cumhail, and around him gathered the Fianna, a great band of warrior hunters who lived half outside ordinary society, roaming the woods and hills of Ireland, hunting the deer and the wild boar, defending the land and sleeping under the open sky. Fionn's father, the leader of the Fianna before him, had been killed in a feud when Fionn was still unborn, and the boy was raised in secret in the forest by 2 wise women, a druidess and a warrior, until he was grown and ready to claim his place. The Fenian tales are full of the green world, of hunting and feasting and poetry, of enchantments met in the deep woods and love found by lonely lakes. They are, on the whole, warmer and more wistful than the iron tales of Ulster, more in love with the wild beauty of Ireland itself, and they begin, fittingly, with a boy and a fish and a drop of hot water. The boy Fionn gained all wisdom from the taste of a magical salmon. The most famous tale of Fionn's boyhood tells how he came by his wisdom. In a deep pool of the River Boyne there swam a salmon, and this was no ordinary fish. It had eaten the nuts that fell from the 9 hazel trees of knowledge that overhung the water, and so all the wisdom of the world had gathered into its flesh. It was foretold that whoever first tasted of the salmon of knowledge would gain that wisdom. An old poet named Fionn had fished for the salmon for 7 long years, and at last he caught it. He gave it to the boy Fionn, then his servant, to cook, warning him on no account to taste it. Fionn turned the fish over the fire, and a blister rose on its skin. And when he pressed it down with his thumb, the hot juice burned him, and without thinking he put his thumb into his mouth to ease the sting. In that instant all the wisdom of the salmon passed into him. When the old poet saw the light of knowledge in the boy's eyes, he understood, and gave him the whole fish, for the prophecy had chosen the child. So often in these tales, the great gift comes not to the one who labors for it, but sideways, by an accident, to the young. Ever after, Fionn found wisdom by putting his thumb to his mouth. The wisdom Fionn gained from the salmon did not leave him. Ever after, whenever he was in doubt or danger, whenever he needed to know a hidden thing or see the shape of what was coming, he had only to put his thumb into his mouth and bite down upon it, and the knowledge would come to him. It was as if a small door to all understanding had been fixed in his own hand, opened by the memory of that first burn. With it he could see through disguises and enchantments, find what was lost, and know the truth of a matter that others could not read. It is a homely human image for wisdom. This, not a crown or a staff or a book, but a boy's burnt thumb and a habit that stayed with him all his life. Perhaps the old storytellers understood that true wisdom is often like that, not some grand possession, but a small quiet source we carry with us, learned once through a bit of pain, and returned to again and again when the world grows dark and we need to know which way to turn. To join the Fianna, a warrior had to pass tests of courage and poetry. The Fianna were no ordinary army, and it was not easy to become one of them. A man who wished to join had to pass a series of severe and unusual tests, for the band prized not only strength but skill, quickness, and even art. He had to be a poet, able to compose verse, for these were not mere brawlers but men of learning too. He had to stand in a pit up to his waist, armed only with a shield and a hazel stick, while 9 warriors cast their spears at him all at once, and if he took a single wound he failed. He had to run through the forest, pursued by the whole band without breaking a branch beneath his foot or letting his braided hair come loose, and without slowing his pace. He had to leap over a branch as high as his brow and pass under one as low as his knee, all while running at full speed. Only those who could do these things were taken in. There is something appealing in a warband that asked its heroes to be poets as well as fighters, to be graceful in the woods as well as deadly, to move through the world lightly and leave it unbroken. Fionn's own son was born of a woman who lived as a deer. The birth of Fionn's most beloved son is one of the tenderest tales in the cycle. Fionn met and loved a woman named Sarv, and she had a secret sorrow. A dark druid had laid an enchantment on her, turning her into a deer, and she had only escaped it and regained her human shape by coming within the bounds of Fionn's home, where the druid's power could not reach. For a while she and Fionn lived in great happiness, and she was carrying his child. But one day, while Fionn was away at the hunt, the dark druid tricked Sarv into stepping outside the safe bounds, and at once the spell fell on her again. She became a deer once more and fled into the wild, and though Fionn searched for her for 7 years, he never found her. Long after, his hunting hounds cornered a wild boy in the forest who had been raised by a deer, and Fionn knew him at once for his own son. He named the boy Oisín, which means little fawn, in memory of the mother lost to the wild, and this fawn child would grow into the greatest poet Ireland ever knew. Oisín, the son of Fionn, became the sweetest poet of the Fianna. Oisín grew into a great warrior of the Fianna, but he was famous above all as their poet, the maker of songs, the keeper of their memory. In him the two loves of the Finian world, war and verse, came together, and it is largely through Oisín, in the old tradition, that the tales of Fionn and his men were remembered and passed down. His name, Little Fawn, kept always the memory of his gentle, wild-born mother, and there was something of the deer's grace in his poetry, swift and shy and beautiful. Of all Fionn's companions, Oisín is the one the tradition loved best, and it gave him the strangest and most haunting destiny of any of them. For while the other heroes of the Fianna met their ends in battle, in the ordinary way of warriors, Oisín was singled out for something far stranger. He would be carried away out of the world entirely, into the land of eternal youth, by a woman who rode to him across the sea on a white horse. And when he came back, he would find that everything he loved had turned to dust. a woman of the Otherworld, rode out of the sea to carry Oisín away. One bright morning, as Fionn and the Fianna rested by a lake after the hunt, they saw a wonder approaching over the water. A young woman of unearthly beauty rode toward them on a white horse, whose hooves did not sink beneath the waves. Her name was Niamh, called Niamh of the golden hair, and she was a princess of Tir na Nog, the land of the young. She had heard of Oisín, of his fame and his poetry, and had crossed from her own country because she had fallen in love with him. She asked him to come away with her to her father's land beyond the western sea, a country where no one grew old, where there was no sorrow and no death, only song and feasting and endless summer. Oisín, looking upon her, loved her too, and though it grieved him to leave his father and his companions, he mounted the white horse behind her. It turned toward the sea and carried them out across the waves and away, and the Fianna on the shore watched the two of them dwindle into the bright distance until they were gone. Beyond the sea lay Tir na Nog, where no one ever grew old. The horse carried Oisín and Niamh over the sea and into the land of the young, and there Oisín found everything she had promised. Tir na Nog was a country of perpetual summer, of green plains and bright rivers and trees always heavy with blossom and fruit at once. No one there grew old or sick. No one wept for long, and the days passed in hunting and feasting and song and love. Oisín married Niamh, and they had children, and he lived in that happy country in what seemed to him a few sweet years, and yet, for all its perfection, a small ache grew in him. Sometimes, amid the endless summer, his mind turned back to Ireland, to his father Fionn, to his old companions and their rough camps and their songs, to the smell of the wet green woods of home. At last the longing to see them again grew too strong to bear, and he asked Niamh's leave to return, just for a visit, just to look once more on the faces he had loved. She let him go, but with a warning, and gave him the white horse to carry him. On no account, she said, must his foot touch the soil of Ireland. Oisín came home to find 300 years had passed. Oisín rode the white horse back across the sea to Ireland, but the land he found was not the land he had left. Everything had changed. The great fortresses of the Fianna were fallen and overgrown. The people he met were small and stooped, and stared at him, a giant on a white horse, as at a figure out of legend. When he asked after Fionn and the Fianna, they told him that these were names from old stories, heroes who had lived and died hundreds of years before. For the few short years Oisín had spent in Tir na Nog had been 300 years in the world of men, and everyone he had ever known was long since dust. Stricken, he turned to ride back to Niamh and the deathless country, but as he passed, he saw some men struggling to move a great stone, and stooping from the saddle to help them, the girth of the horse broke, and he fell, and his foot, at last, touched the soil of Ireland. In that instant the 300 years fell upon him all at once. The white horse fled, and Oisín rose from the ground a blind and withered old man, the last of the Fianna, left alone at the wrong end of time. The last of the Fianna told his tales to a new and Christian age. There is a beautiful epilogue to Oisín's story, one the old Christian monks who wrote it down clearly loved. Fallen and aged in a world that had forgotten his people, Oisín was found, the tradition says, by Saint Patrick himself, in the days when the new faith was coming to Ireland. The two old men, the last pagan hero and the Christian saint, fell to talking, and their long conversation, the colloquy of the ancients, became a way to gather up the old tales one last time. Patrick's scribes wrote down all that Oisín remembered of Fionn and the Fianna, of their hunts and battles and the beauty of the vanished world, and the two argued, gently and endlessly, about which age was better, Oisín grieving for the free wild glory of the Fianna, Patrick preaching the peace of the new God. It is a tender image on which to close the age of heroes, an old man remembering a lost world so that it would not be lost entirely, handing his memories across the great divide of time, so that we, at the far end of it, might still hear them tonight. A young woman laid a binding spell on Diarmid to make him carry her away. Among the finest of the Finian tales is the pursuit of Diarmid and Gren. When Fionn was old, it was arranged that he should marry Gren, a young princess, the daughter of the High King. But at the wedding feast, Grin looked instead upon Diarmaid, one of the handsomest and best loved of the young Fianna, and set her heart on him. Diarmaid, loyal to his lord, would not betray Fionn, so Grin laid upon him a gais, one of those sacred binding vows that no hero of these tales could refuse without shame and ruin, commanding him to take her away with him that very night. Bound by the vow against his own will and honor, Diarmaid fled with her into the wild, and so began the great pursuit, with Fionn and the Fianna hunting the two runaways the length and breadth of Ireland. For years they were chased from wood to cave to mountain, never sleeping 2 nights in the same place, leaving behind them the beds of cold stone that country people still point to as the beds of Diarmaid and Green. It is a tale of love that no one quite chose, and loyalty broken not by desire, but by a word that could not be unsaid. Diarmaid met his death by the one beast he was forbidden to hunt. For a long time the pursuit ended in an uneasy peace. Fionn, at last, seemed to forgive the lovers, and Diarmaid and Grain settled down and lived quietly for years. But Fionn's grudge, the tale hints, was never truly gone. There was a gais upon Diarmaid, a prohibition from his strange childhood, that he must never hunt the wild boar, for his fate was bound up with a great enchanted pig. One day Fionn invited him to a boar hunt on the slopes of Ben Bulben, and Diarmaid, his pride pricked, went against the old prohibition. The boar gored him, and he lay dying on the mountainside. Now Fionn had another gift, for it was said that any wounded man who drank water from Fionn's cupped hands would be healed. Twice Fionn went to the well, and twice, remembering his old jealousy, he let the water run away between his fingers before he reached Diarmaid. By the time he mastered himself and brought the water, it was too late, and Diarmaid was dead. So the greatest of the young Fianna died not in battle, but of an old wound in an old heart that could not quite forgive. Fionn's most faithful hounds had once been human children. Not all of Fionn's companions walked on 2 legs. His 2 great hunting hounds, Bran and Scolan, were dearer to him than almost any of his men, swift and huge and wise beyond the nature of dogs. And there was a reason for their strange intelligence, for the tales say they were not truly dogs at all, but Fionn's own cousins. Their mother, a kinswoman of Fionn, had been turned into a hound while she was pregnant by the enchantment of a jealous woman of the sea, and so her children were born as pups, though the blood of people ran in them. Fionn loved them, and they ran at his side through every hunt, and their names echo all through the Fenian tales. There is a gentleness in this, and something very Irish, the idea that the boundary between people and animals is thin and easily crossed, that the deer in the wood or the hound at the fire might be a lost kinsman under a spell, deserving of love and pity. In these stories, no creature is ever quite only what it seems. Each year at Tara, Fionn faced a fire-breathing harper from the mounds. One of Fionn's own great deeds explains how he first won the leadership of the Fianna. Every year at the festival of Samhain, a being of the sea named Eilean came out of the mounds to the royal hill of Tara. He would play sweet, drowsy strains that laid the whole court helplessly asleep, and then breathe out fire and burn the great hall to the ground, and no one could stop him, for none could stay awake against his enchanted playing. For 23 years this had gone on. Then young Fionn came to Tara and offered to rid them of the creature. To keep himself awake against the sleeping strains, he pressed the blade of his own spear against his brow, so that the pain and the cold iron held sleep at bay. And when Eilean came and played and then turned to loose his fire, Fionn was waiting, awake, and slew him. In reward he was given command of the Fianna, which his father had held before him. It is a fitting tale for the Fenian hero, a battle won not by mere strength, but by the will to stay awake through a melody made to close the eyes. The green mounds of Ireland were believed to be the doors of the gods. We come now to the sacred landscape itself, to the places where the old stories touched the real earth. Across Ireland stand the ancient mounds, the raths and barrows and grassy hills that the old people called the sea. To them these were not merely heaps of earth or forgotten graves. They were the dwellings of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the doors into the hidden country beneath, the homes of the fair folk who had gone into the ground when the mortal Milesians took the surface of the land. Each great mound had its lord and its lady, its own otherworldly household, and on certain nights of the year, above all at Samhain, the mounds were said to open and their bright inhabitants to come and go between the worlds. Country people gave these places a wide and careful respect and would not dig into them or disturb them for any reward. It is a way of seeing the land that turns the whole countryside into something alive and inhabited. Every green hill a possible threshold, every quiet mound a house with someone home. Even now, some of that old caution lingers over the ancient places of Ireland. The greatest of these mounds was a house of the gods older than the pyramids. The most famous of all the sacred mounds is Newgrange, which the old tales call Brúna Búni, the mansion on the Boyne, and name as the dwelling of Angus, the young god of love, and of the Dagda before him. It is a vast round mound of earth and stone, ringed by great carved curbstones, with a narrow stone passage running deep into its heart. And it is astonishingly old. It was raised more than 5,000 years ago, in the deep of the Stone Age, older than the great pyramids of Egypt, older than almost any building still standing in the world. The people who made it are long vanished and nameless, but the later Irish, coming upon this enormous ancient thing in their green country, knew in their hearts that no ordinary hands had made it. It must be, they felt, a house of the gods. And so into their stories it went, the shining otherworldly palace on the river. To stand before it is to feel the depth of time open beneath you. So many ages of people gazing at the same great mound, and each deciding, in their turn, that here the gods must surely live. Once a year, the rising sun reaches down the passage to the mound's heart. The people who built Newgrange left within it a wonder that lay hidden and forgotten for thousands of years, until it was discovered again in our own age. Above the entrance to the long stone passage they set a special opening, a slot in the stone that they called, in a later age, the roof box. For all but a few days of the year it does nothing, and the inner chamber deep inside the mound lies in total darkness. But on the mornings around the winter solstice, the shortest days of the year, as the sun rises low in the southeast, its first light strikes that opening, and a narrow beam creeps slowly down the whole length of the passage, and reaches at last into the very heart of the mound, and fills the innermost chamber with a soft golden light for a few minutes, before it fades. 5,000 years ago, someone aligned a mountain of stone to catch the turning of the year, to mark the moment when the dying sun begins to return. There is no story that can improve on that. In the darkest days, a people built a room to hold, for a few minutes, the coming back of the light. At the hill of Tara, the high kings of Ireland were made. If Newgrange was the house of the gods, the hill of Tara was the heart of the kings. This low green hill, with its rings of ancient earthworks, was the sacred center of the sovereignty of Ireland, the place where the high kings were made and where the great assemblies were held. To be king of Tara was, in the ideal of the old tales, to be the true king of all Ireland. Upon the hill stood the Lia Fail, the stone of destiny that cried out beneath the rightful ruler. And here the ceremonies of kingship were performed, binding the new king to the land in a kind of sacred marriage. Around Tara gathered all the great themes of the Irish tales, sovereignty and the sacred, the mortal king and the otherworldly powers that granted or withheld his right to rule. Much of what stood there is gone now, worn down to grassy banks and hollows in a wide field, where the wind moves over the ridges and the whole green country falls away on every side. But it remains one of the most storied pieces of ground in all of Ireland, a quiet hill that once held the idea of a whole nation's kingship. The sacred center of the land was marked by a great stone at Uisneach. Ireland was imagined, in the old reckoning, as divided into provinces, 4 around the edges and a 5th, sacred, in the middle. And at the very center of the land, where the provinces were said to meet, stood the hill of Uisneach, marked by a huge boulder called the Stone of Divisions, the navel of Ireland. Here, the tales say, a sacred fire was kindled at the festival of Beltane, at the beginning of summer, and from this central flame the new fire was carried out to light the hearths of all the country, so that the whole island was, in a sense, warmed from a single heart. Uisneach was the meeting place, the balance point, the still center around which the wheel of Ireland turned. It is a beautiful piece of old geography, this idea of a country with a sacred middle, a single stone and a single fire from which everything spreads out and to which everything belongs. Wherever you stood in Ireland, you could turn your mind toward that central hill and know yourself part of one whole thing, gathered around one old fire in the dark. A silver branch and a strange song called one king to sail into the west. The old Irish told a whole class of tales called Imrama, voyage tales, in which a hero sets out by sea and wanders from wonder to wonder among the enchanted islands of the Western Ocean. The oldest is the voyage of Bran mac Febail. One day, as Bran walked near his fort, he heard a melody so sweet behind him that it lulled him into sleep. And when he woke, there lay beside him a branch of silver, heavy with white blossom, from an otherworldly apple tree. Then a woman in strange clothing appeared in his hall, and sang to him of a wondrous land across the sea, an island of women, a place of joy without sickness or sorrow or death. When she had sung, she vanished, and the branch leapt from Bran's hand into hers, and he could not hold it. So Bran gathered his companions and set sail westward to find that country. He met Manannán the sea god riding over the waves, and passed the island of joy and the island of women, and stayed there in bliss for what seemed a year. But like Oisín after him, his men grew homesick, and when they returned and one leapt ashore, he crumbled at once to ashes, for centuries had passed. So Bran, from his boat, told their story to the people on the shore, and then turned and sailed away, and was never seen again. Another voyager sailed the western sea, and learned at last to forgive. The most elaborate of the voyage tales is the voyage of Maelduin. Maelduin set out across the ocean to find and avenge his murdered father, sailing with a crew in a small skin-covered boat. But the sea carried him far off his course, out among a great archipelago of marvelous islands, each stranger than the last. There was an island of enormous ants, an island of birds, an island where a beast raced round and round, an island with a fiery revolving rampart, an island of endless laughter, an island where a stream arched through the air like a rainbow. On and on they wandered, meeting wonder after wonder, hermits and enchantments and warnings. And slowly, through all these strange encounters, the desire for vengeance that had begun the voyage drained out of Maelduin. When at last he came upon the very men who had killed his father, he found he no longer wished to harm them, and made peace instead, and went home. It is a wonderful shape for a story, a journey begun in anger that becomes, island by island, a long lesson in wonder and forgiveness, until the traveler comes home changed, and lets his old grievance sink into the sea behind him. Many a hero's fate hung upon a single sacred prohibition. Running through all these tales, from the gods to the heroes to the kings, is a strange and powerful idea, the guise. A guise was a sacred prohibition or obligation laid upon a person, a kind of magical taboo, forbidding them some particular act or binding them to another. To keep one's giesa was to stay in right relation with the unseen order of things. To break one, even by accident, even when forced, was to invite ruin and death. We have seen them at work all night. Diarmid was forbidden to hunt the boar and died of it. Cú Chulainn was bound by contradictory vows that his enemies used to trap and undo him. Great kings held giesa that hemmed their lives about with rules known only to the wise. There is something in it that speaks to a very old sense of how the world works, that every person walks a narrow path fenced by unseen conditions, and that fate is not so much a doom that falls on you from outside as a thread woven through your own choices and prohibitions, waiting to be pulled tight. To live well, in that old view, was to know your own giesa and to keep them. One doomed king watched his prohibitions fall one by one in a single night. The most terrible tale of the guise is that of Conaire Mór, a high king of Ireland whose reign began in perfect peace and prosperity, for he was a rightful and sacred king. His kingship was hedged about with many giesa, strange and specific prohibitions, and so long as he kept them, the land flourished. But circumstances, and the malice of his enemies, and his own small mercies, drew him one by one into breaking them, until in a single dreadful night he had broken nearly all. Benighted, he was forced to take shelter in the great hostel of Dardurga. though that too broke a vow, and there his enemies gathered and besieged the house and set it aflame. Inside, the king was seized by a burning magical thirst, and there was no water to be found, and his greatest champion ran through the whole country seeking a single cup for him, and came back too late. Cynnar died there in the burning hostel, his Giesa all broken, his sacred kingship undone. It is a dark and dreamlike tale of how a good king, hemmed in by fate and forced by small steps off the narrow path, can lose everything in the turning of one long night. The right to rule was granted by a goddess who first appeared as a hag. Beneath all the tales of kingship lies one deep idea, that the king was wed to the land itself, and that the land was a goddess, the sovereignty of Ireland, who chose whom she would have. There is a famous tale that gives this idea a face. The young Niall, who would become a great high king, went hunting with his brothers, and they grew thirsty. At a well they found a hideous old hag, black and bent and monstrous, guarding the water, and she would give a drink only to the one who would kiss her. One by one his brothers refused, or gave the barest touch, but Niall kissed her fully and without reluctance, and even embraced her. And in his arms the loathsome hag was transformed into the most beautiful woman in the world. She was the sovereignty of Ireland, she told him, and as he had taken her when she was ugly and hard, so the kingship would be, hard and ugly at the first, but growing to great beauty in the end, and she granted the crown to him and to his descendants. It is a profound old teaching, hidden in a fireside tale, that the things most worth having often come first in a shape we must have the courage to embrace before they turn fair. At the heart of the world stood a well ringed by the hazels of knowledge. We have met, more than once tonight, the image of the well of wisdom, and it is worth pausing on it, for it lies at the very center of the old imagination. Somewhere in the Otherworld, the tales say, there was a sacred well or spring, the source of all the rivers and of all wisdom, and over it hung 9 hazel trees. These hazels dropped their bright nuts into the water, and the nuts were the concentrated essence of all knowledge. The salmon that swam in the well ate the nuts, and so became the salmon of knowledge, and whoever ate the salmon, as young Fionn did, gained its wisdom. Even the goddess Boan drowned seeking the power of such a well. There is a whole way of thinking folded into this single image, that wisdom is not made but found, that it wells up from a hidden source at the center of things, passing from the tree to the water to the fish to the person, and that to be wise is to have drunk, by luck or by daring, from a spring that was there long before us. When you drift towards sleep, you too are moving toward a still, deep water at the center of yourself. The keepers of all this knowledge were the Druids. The learning of the old Irish world was held by a special class, the Druids, and their fellow poets and law speakers. They were far more than the robed magicians of later imagination. They were the memory and the mind of their people, the keepers of history and genealogy and law, the astronomers who watched the turning year, the advisors who stood at the shoulders of kings, the poets whose praise could raise a man and whose satire could ruin him. Their training was long, taking many years, for they committed vast stores of knowledge to memory, distrusting writing for their most sacred lore, and carried whole libraries in their heads. They read omens in the flight of birds and the shapes of clouds, kindled the sacred fires of the festivals, and stood between their people and the unseen powers. When the new faith came to Ireland, much of their role passed to the monks and the scholars, who remarkably wrote down the very tales the Druids had guarded, and so the memory survived the men who kept it, poured from one vessel into another, all the way down to the page and the voice that carry it to you now. The old year turned on 4 great festivals of fire and season. The old Irish measured their year not by our calendar, but by 4 great festivals that marked the turning of the seasons, and each had its own character and its own place in the tales. There was Samhain at the start of winter, when the year turned dark and the doors of the Otherworld swung open. There was Imbolc at the first stirring of spring, sacred to Brigid. There was Beltane at the beginning of summer, a festival of fire and growth. And there was Lughnasadh at the harvest, named for the god Lugh. Together they divided the year into its 4 quarters, each ushered in with fires and gatherings, with rites to protect the cattle and the crops, and to keep the community in right relation with the powers of the land. This was a people who lived close to the turning of the light, who felt each season arrive as a real threshold to be crossed with care. We will visit each of these festivals in turn, but feel, first, the shape of that year, a slow wheel of dark and light, turning and returning, the same 4 fires kindled on the same hills, age after age, against the same coming night. Samhain was the night when the wall between the worlds grew thin. The greatest and most uncanny of the festivals was Samhain, at the beginning of November, marking the end of the harvest and the start of the dark half of the year. On this night, above all others, the boundary between our world and the Otherworld was believed to wear thin, so that the dead might return to visit their old homes, and the fair folk might come out of the mounds and move abroad among the living. It was a time both sacred and perilous, when the ordinary rules were suspended and the unseen drew close. The cattle were brought down from the hills, great fires were lit, and people were careful, on such a night, about where they walked and what they might meet in the dark. Many of the old customs of Samhain, the fires, the masks and disguises to hide from wandering spirits, the offerings left out for the dead, have flowed down the centuries into the festival the world now keeps at Halloween. But at its root it was something quieter and deeper. One night a year when a people turned to face their dead, and left a door and a little food for whatever might come. Bealtaine welcomed the summer with fires kindled on the hills. Opposite Samhain, in the wheel of the year, stood Bealtaine, at the beginning of May, the festival of the summer's coming. If Samhain opened the dark half of the year, Bealtaine opened the bright, and it was above all a festival of fire and of fertile life. Great bonfires were kindled on the hilltops, and in a central rite the cattle were driven between 2 such fires, or through their smoke, to cleanse and protect them before they went up to the high summer pastures. On this morning people washed their faces in the dew, and gathered the first flowers of summer to deck their doors, and the hearth fires of the houses, put out for the occasion, were rekindled from the sacred bonfire, so that all the flames of the community came from one source. It was a hopeful, outward-facing festival, full of the promise of warmth and growth and long light after the hard months. Where Samanar turned the people toward the dead and the dark, Bealtaine turned them toward the sun, the green grass, and the season of plenty just beginning to open all around them. Imbolc marked the first faint stirrings of spring, and belonged to Brigid. Between the deep of winter and the coming of summer lay Imbolc, at the beginning of February, the gentlest of the 4 festivals. It marked the very first stirrings of spring, the time when the ewes began to give milk again, and the earliest signs of new life showed in the cold land, long before the warmth truly came. Imbolc belonged to Brigid, the bright goddess of fire and poetry and healing, and later to the saint who inherited her name, and it remained her day through all the centuries after. On its eve, people made small crosses of woven rushes for protection, and left out a cloth or a ribbon overnight for Brigid to bless as she passed. It was a festival of hope held in the cold, a quiet noticing that the year had turned some invisible corner, that although the fields were still bare and the nights still long, the light was, imperceptibly, coming back. There is a tenderness in a people who marked not only the great blaze of summer, but this small, early, almost secret promise of it. The first drop of milk, the first green blade, the faint far-off warmth still weeks away. Lugnasad gathered the people for the harvest, in the name of a god. The last of the 4 festivals was Lugnasad, at the beginning of August, the festival of the harvest's beginning, when the first grain was cut and the fruits of the year began to come in. It took its name from the god Lu, that shining master of every art, and the old tradition said he had founded it as a funeral games in honor of his foster mother, who had died clearing the plains of Ireland for planting. So it was a festival of gathering, marked by great fairs and assemblies where people came together from far around, to trade and to feast, to race horses and hold contests of strength and skill, to settle disputes, and to make matches and marriages. It was the most social of the festivals, a bright crowded gathering at the top of the summer, with the hard work of the harvest just ahead, but the first of its plenty already in hand. Some of these great old fairs went on being held, in one form or another for many centuries, and echoes of them survive in the harvest gatherings of Ireland even now. In the very name of the season's festival, the people kept the memory of their bright god alive. The cry of the banshee foretold a death in the family. From the great festivals we turn to the smaller, closer spirits of Irish folklore, the beings that lingered in the countryside long after the gods had faded. Best known of all is the banshee, the Bean Sive, whose name means simply the woman of the fairy mounds. She was not a bringer of death but a mourner of it, an otherworldly woman attached to certain old families, who appeared to keen and wail when one of that family was about to die. Her cry, heard in the night, thin and rising and unbearably sorrowful, was the sign that a death was coming, and there was no bargaining with it, only the grief of knowing. Sometimes she was glimpsed as a woman combing her long hair by a river, or as a figure at the edge of the fields in the dusk. She was frightening, and yet there is something almost tender in her too, for she came to grieve, to make sure that a passing did not go unmourned, in a land that took its dead seriously. Even the leaving of the world had its appointed watcher, a voice in the dark to say that someone was worth weeping for. The Puka was a shapeshifter who could bless a traveler or lead him astray. Among the most mischievous of the fairy beings was the Puka, a shapeshifter of the twilight roads. It could take many forms, most often a horse, but also a goat, a dog, a hare, or a great black bird, and its nature was famously unpredictable. A Puka in the shape of a wild dark horse might come upon a lone traveler at night and sweep him up onto its back for a mad, terrifying ride across the country, over hedge and river, before tumbling him off, shaken but usually unharmed, at the dawn. It could be malicious, spoiling crops and frightening livestock, and yet it could also be helpful, and it was thought unlucky to speak ill of it. There was a custom of leaving a share of the harvest in the field as the Puka's portion, and after the festival of Samhain, whatever fruit remained unpicked was said to belong to it, spoiled by its touch and not to be eaten. The Puka belongs to that great Irish family of beings who are neither good nor evil but simply other, powers of the wild edge of things, to be respected and placated rather than trusted or defied. Off the western coasts moved the seal folk and the people of the waves. The sea around Ireland had its own enchanted inhabitants. There were the Selkies, the seal folk, who swam as seals in the cold water but could come ashore, slip off their sealskins, and walk as beautiful men and women upon the land. There is a wistful tale, told all along the western and northern coasts, of a fisherman who found a Selkie woman dancing on the shore, stole and hid her sealskin so that she could not return to the sea, and took her for his wife. She lived with him and bore his children, and was a good wife. But always there was a sorrow in her, a longing for the water, and always she searched. And in the end she found her hidden skin, and put it on, and slipped back into the waves, and was gone, though she was said to watch over her children from the sea forever after. There were Merrows too, the mermaids of Irish story, and other people of the waves. In all these tales runs the same deep note, the pull of the sea, the sorrow of a creature caught between two worlds, belonging wholly to neither, always half listening for the tide. Sometimes, it was feared, the fair folk stole a child and left one of their own. Not all the beliefs about the fairy folk were gentle, and one of the darkest was the fear of the changeling. It was thought that the fair folk sometimes coveted a healthy human child, or a new bride, or a strong young person, and would steal them away into the mounds, leaving in their place a substitute, a sickly fairy creature, or an enchanted piece of wood, given the seeming of the person taken. A child who failed to thrive, who sickened or changed, might be whispered of as a changeling, not the true child at all, but a fairy left in its place. Sad and sometimes cruel customs grew up around this fear, ways people hoped to protect the vulnerable, iron laid in the cradle, a garment turned inside out, salt and fire and holy words. Behind the strange belief we can feel the real griefs it tried to explain, the illnesses and losses of children in a hard age, the sudden changes in a loved one that no one could account for. It was a way of giving a shape and a story to sorrows too heavy to hold. And, sometimes, a desperate hope that the lost one was not dead, but only taken, and might yet be won back. The Hag of Winter shaped the very hills and held the cold in her hands. One of the oldest and grandest of the folk figures is the Ciliach, the Hag, the Veiled One, a vast and ancient female power, older, it seems, than the gods themselves. She was the spirit of winter, the crone who ruled the cold half of the year, and she was bound up with the shape of the land itself. Many a mountain and standing stone and strange rock formation was said to have been made by her, dropped from her apron as she strode across the country, or flung down in her labors, so that she had literally built the landscape with her hands. In the tales, she is immensely old, having lived through many ages and seen many husbands and peoples come and go. And in some stories, she renews herself, growing young again with the turning year, only to age once more into winter. She is the land grown old and hard and enduring, the frost on the mountain, the grey stone under the heather. And when the winter closes in and the hills go bare and cold, the old people knew whose season it was, and felt the Ciliach moving over the high ground, wrapped in her grey veil, patient as the rock. In the fields of Ireland, a single thorn tree was left standing out of respect. The reverence for the fairy folk left marks upon the land that can still be seen today. Here and there in the green fields of Ireland stands a single hawthorn tree, alone in the middle of ploughed ground, left carefully uncut while the farmer worked around it year after year. These are the fairy thorns, the lone bushes believed to belong to the good people, to mark a meeting place or a doorway of theirs, and to bring terrible bad luck on anyone who dared to cut one down. Stories were told, and are still told, of men who felled a fairy thorn and met with ruin or death soon after, of new roads and buildings diverted at great cost rather than disturb one of these solitary trees. It is a remarkable thing, this quiet survival of the old belief into the modern world, a wariness deep enough that even now people will leave a scrubby little thorn tree standing in the middle of a valuable field, just in case, just out of the old respect. The gods went into the mounds long ago, but something of the caution they inspired still grows, thorned and stubborn, in the open fields. The little cobbler of the fairy world guarded a hidden crock of gold. Perhaps the most famous of all the fairy beings in the wider world is the leprechaun, though in the old tradition he is a smaller and stranger figure than the cheerful mascot he has become. He was a solitary fairy, a little bearded craftsman, a shoemaker by trade, and he was often heard before he was seen by the tiny tap-tapping of his hammer as he mended a single shoe in some hidden corner of the countryside. The leprechauns were said to have grown rich, keeping crocks of gold hidden away, and the great game with them was that if you could catch one and keep your eyes fixed upon him, he was bound to lead you to his treasure. But he was endlessly cunning, and the moment your gaze flicked aside, tricked away by some clever word of his, he would vanish, and the gold with him. He is a smaller note than the great gods and heroes we have followed tonight, a figure of country humor rather than of awe, but he too came down from the same old world of the sea, the last small echo of a people who lived just out of sight, guarding their gold in the green hollows of the land. The old beliefs survived at holy wells and under sacred trees. When the new faith came to Ireland, the old sacred places did not simply vanish. Again and again, the reverence once paid to a spring or a tree or a stone flowed quietly on beneath the surface of the new religion. All across Ireland there are holy wells, hundreds of them, places of pilgrimage and quiet prayer, where people still come to leave an offering and ask for healing, and many of these were almost certainly sacred long before any church stood near them. Wells of the old gods given new names and new saints. Beside them often grow the rag trees, where those who come tie a small strip of cloth to the branches as they make their wish or their prayer, so that the tree stands hung with fluttering ribbons, slowly fading in the weather. It is one of the gentlest survivals of the old world. This, the same instinct that once left milk at the fairy mound, now leaving a ribbon on a branch by a holy well. The names change and the prayers change, but the deep human gesture stays the same, the wish to leave something at a sacred place and to be heard. All these tales were carried down the ages by memory and by patient hands. It is worth pausing near the end to wonder how any of this survived at all. For centuries, these stories lived only in memory, in the trained minds of the poets and druids who held them, and in the voices of ordinary people telling them by the fire on long nights. They might have vanished utterly, as the beliefs of so many old peoples have vanished. That they did not is owed, strangely, to the very monks of the new faith, who in their quiet scriptoria wrote down the old pagan tales of gods and heroes, even as they served a different god, preserving on precious vellum the myths their own religion had displaced. And it is owed too to the country people who went on telling the tales for 1,000 years more, mother to child, neighbour to neighbour, keeping Fionn and Cú Chulainn and the fair folk alive on their tongues until scholars came at last to write them down again. The whole long chain of it, from the druid's memory to the monk's pen, to the fireside voice to the page, has carried these dreams across more than 1,000 years and set them down, at the last, here, in the quiet, with you. Beneath all these stories lies one gentle promise of a land without death. As our journey draws toward its close, let us return to where we began, to that other country lying just beside our own. Through all the tales we have followed tonight, from the coming of the gods to the last of the fairy thorns, runs one deep and constant longing. The dream of the Otherworld, the land of the ever-young, where no one grows old, no one falls ill, and no one is parted for long from those they love. The Irish placed it just out of reach, across the western sea, or within the green hills, or a single breath away on the night when the veil grows thin. It was a country where the fruit never fell, the singing never stopped, and the light of a long summer evening never quite faded into dark. Every people, in their own way, has dreamed such a place, and the old Irish dreamed it more beautifully than almost anyone. You do not have to believe in it to be comforted by it tonight, to let its endless soft evenings settle over you as you drift, its melody somewhere just below hearing, its green hills waiting, its door left open in the dark. As we come to the end of our journey, let your mind drift back one last time over the green island and its dreams. Remember the Tuatha Dé Danann coming down through the mist with their 4 treasures, and the stone that cried out beneath the true king. Remember Louvre of the many arts at the gate of Tara, and the Dagda's harp that played the whole world to sleep. Remember Cú Chulainn alone at the ford through the long winter, and Oisín riding the white horse into the west with Niam of the golden hair. Remember Newgrange in the dark, waiting 5,000 years to catch a single beam of the returning sun, and the lone thorn tree still standing, out of respect, in the middle of the field. These stories were carried to you across more than 1,000 years, hand to hand and voice to voice, and now they can rest, and so can you. If you enjoyed this slow journey, you can support the channel by liking, subscribing, or leaving a comment. It helps these bedtime journeys find the people who need them. And if you are still awake, there will be another video waiting for you on the screen. But there is no need to reach for it now. Let your jaw unclench, let your shoulders drop, let the small weight of the day slide gently off you and sink away into the dark. Breathe in, slowly and out, and let the green hills soften around you, and the mist come down, and the door in the hillside stand quietly open, with a warm light within, waiting, in no hurry at all, for whenever you are ready. Sleep well, and good night.